Step into the shadow of towering stone walls, where the whispers of history still linger in every drafty corridor and flickering torchlight. Picture yourself standing in the heart of a medieval castle, not as a tourist, but as someone who belonged there. The air is thick with the smell of hearth fires and fresh rushes strewn across the floor, while the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer reminds you that this place was never silent. Castles weren't just fortresses or symbols of power. They were living, breathing communities, pulsing with activity from dawn until long after dark. And behind every archway, every spiral staircase, there are stories waiting to be told, stories that will change how you see these ancient strongholds forever. Think you know what life was like inside a medieval castle? Prepare to have your expectations turned upside down. Forget the Hollywood versions of banquets and battles. Real castle life was a delicate dance of duty, survival, and even unexpected luxuries. Did you know that some lords employed personal jesters, not just for entertainment, but as trusted advisors? Or that the lady of the castle often managed the entire household's finances, wielding power that rivaled her husband's? From the grueling work of scullions scrubbing pots in smoky kitchens to the intricate rituals of courtly love, every corner of the castle had its own rhythm, its own secrets. These walls witnessed whispered alliances, ingenious inventions, and moments of startling humanity that history books often overlook. This isn't just a glimpse into the past, it's an invitation to walk those storied halls yourself. Over the next 30 revelations, you'll discover how castles functioned as self-sufficient worlds, where everything from medicine to justice was handled within their walls. You'll meet the unsung heroes who kept the fires burning and the nobles who schemed by candlelight, and you'll uncover the little details like why beds were so short or how secret passages weren't just for escape but for eavesdropping, that made castle life as messy, vibrant, and surprising as our own lives today. So ready your curiosity. The past is about to come alive in ways you never imagined. The moment you step through the gates of a medieval castle, the first thing that would strike you isn't the grandeur or the cold stone, it's the noise. Forget the hushed, ghostly ruins we see today. These places were anything but silent. Imagine the constant clang of the blacksmith's hammer shaping swords and horseshoes, the rhythmic thud of the baker kneading dough before dawn, and the shouts of stable boys herding animals through crowded courtyards. Even the walls themselves seemed to hum with activity, as masons chiseled repairs and carpenters sawed wood for furniture or siege defenses. Nightfall didn't bring quiet either. Guards paced the battlements, their boots scraping against stone as they called out the hour or exchanged gossip to stay awake. Servants bustled through dimly lit corridors, hauling firewood or late-night meals for nobles burning the midnight oil over ledgers or letters. And if you listen closely, you might even catch the faint strum of a minstrel's lute from the great hall, where laughter and music often spilled into the early hours. This relentless energy wasn't just background noise, it was the lifeblood of the castle. Every clatter and cry served a purpose, from the clinking of coins as merchants haggled in the bailey to the steady grind of the mill turning grain into flour. Even the animals played their part. Dogs barked at intruders, chickens clucked in their coops, and hunting falcons screeched from their perches. The idea of a deserted, echoing fortress. That's pure fantasy. These were places where silence meant something was wrong. A missed watch shift, a stalled kitchen fire, or worse, an impending attack. So the next time you picture a castle, don't imagine a museum frozen in time. Imagine a thriving, noisy world where every sound told a story. The Great Hall wasn't just the grandest room in the castle. It was the beating heart of daily life, a chameleon of a space that transformed with the hour. By day, it roared with activity. Long wooden tables groaned under platters of roasted meats and trenchers of bread, while nobles and servants alike jostled for space on shared benches. This was where justice was dispensed by the Lord, his word law as he settled disputes between villagers or punished thieves. It's where traveling merchants unfurled their wares on the stone floor, and where scribes scratched out contracts by candlelight. Every inch of this cavernous room had a purpose, and none of it was wasted. But as dusk fell, the hall underwent a quiet revolution. Servants scurried to clear the tables, stacking dishes and sweeping crumbs into the rushes that covered the floor, rushes that weren't just for decoration, but helped insulate against the cold stone. Then came the straw mats, unrolled in orderly rows like a patchwork quilt across the floor. Lower-ranking servants, guards, and even visiting tradesmen would claim their spots, wrapping themselves in woolen blankets as the fire dwindled to embers. The very air changed, no longer thick with the scent of spiced wine and roasted meats, but with the earthy smell of straw and the soft murmurs of shared stories before sleep. This nightly transformation reveals a truth Hollywood often misses. Castles weren't just about grandeur, but ingenious adaptability. The same floor that hosted a noble's feast at noon might cradle an exhausted scullion by midnight. And that practicality extended beyond sleeping arrangements. The high ceilings weren't just for show. They allowed smoke from the central hearth to rise away from diners. The thick walls held hidden alcoves where servants could stash extra tables or bedding at a moment's notice. Even the Lord's raised dais at one end of the hall wasn't merely symbolic. It let him oversee both feasts and court proceedings with equal authority. What's truly remarkable is how this single room mirrored the social hierarchy of the entire castle. The Lord and his family might retreat to private chambers at night, but everyone else lived in fluid, shared space, a reminder that medieval life was deeply communal. Your bedmate one night might be the baker who'd need your breakfast bread, or the carpenter repairing the castle gates at dawn. No walls divided work from rest, justice from celebration. The Great Hall was a stage where every act of daily life played out, and its stones absorbed centuries of laughter, arguments, and whispered secrets. To understand this room is to understand the rhythm of castle life itself, never static, always evolving, and far more intimate than we usually imagine. Walk through most castle chambers today, and you'll find roped-off rooms labeled Lord's Bedchamber or Lady's Solar, spaces that feel intimate, almost modern. But step back into the Middle Ages, and you'd quickly realize how extraordinary those private quarters really were. For the vast majority of castle dwellers, from armor-clad knights to kitchen scullions, the concept of privacy simply didn't exist. Knights meant curling up shoulder to shoulder with dozens of others in the Great Hall, on barracks floors, or even in stairwells. Personal space wasn't just scarce, it was a visible marker of power, reserved exclusively for those at the very top of the feudal pyramid. Consider the sleeping arrangements. Servants sprawled on straw-filled sacks in the kitchens, their faces smudged with soot from the day's fires. Soldiers dozed in the guardroom, their weapons within arm's reach, while visiting merchants and craftsmen bedded down in storerooms or stables. Even castle chaplains, men of God, typically slept in the chapel itself, their beds little more than pallets tucked between pews. The air in these shared spaces hung thick with the scent of sweat, wool, and the faint metallic tang of armor oil. Privacy wasn't merely absent, it was unimaginable. Now contrast that with the Lord and Lady's chambers. tucked away in the keep's uppermost floors or behind layers of fortified walls, these rooms were sanctuaries of solitude. Heavy tapestries muffled sound, while lockable doors, a rarity elsewhere, kept prying eyes at bay. The lady's solar, often adjoined by a private garderobe toilet, might feature a cushioned window seat where she could read, embroider, or receive close confidences without an audience. These weren't just bedrooms, they were statements. A noble's ability to withdraw from the crowd signaled not just wealth, but control over their environment, their time, even their thoughts. This divide went deeper than physical comfort. In a world where most people lived their entire lives within earshot of others, privacy granted the elite something priceless: the freedom to scheme. Political alliances, marriage negotiations, even plans for war could be discussed behind closed doors without servants' ears catching whispers. Meanwhile, the lack of private spaces for others reinforced social order. If you slept in a room with 20 people, secrets were nearly impossible to keep, and that was the point. Every snore, every murmured conversation reminded castle inhabitants of their place in the hierarchy. Yet there's a twist to this tale of medieval inequality. While nobles prized their solitude, their private chambers often doubled as workplaces. The lord's bedchamber frequently hosted meetings with advisors, its large bed serving as a makeshift throne. The lady's solar might buzz with estate managers delivering harvest reports or seamstresses measuring fabric for new gowns. Even in retreat, the elite were never truly alone. Their version of privacy wasn't about isolation, but selective access, a privilege that kept them at the center of the castle's bustling web of power. So the next time you see a roped-off bedchamber in a restored castle, look closer. Those empty rooms once thrummed with quiet authority, their very existence a daily reminder of who ruled and who didn't. If you think modern bathrooms are inconvenient, medieval castle life would have been a rude awakening, especially for your nose. Chamber pots weren't just discreet necessities tucked under beds. They were ubiquitous, from the lord's private quarters to the bustling kitchens. Made of ceramic or metal, these unassuming vessels held a far less glamorous reality of castle living. Picture a noblewoman lifting her skirts to use one behind a tapestry, or a soldier balancing his on a narrow windowsill. And when full, the contents often met a swift and very public end. Servants might carry them down winding staircases to dump outside, but just as often, the quickest solution was simply tipping them out the nearest window. This is where that infamous cry of garderobes came into play, a warning shouted before waste rained down into castle courtyards or streets below. Originating from the French gardes à l'eau, watch out for the water, it was the medieval equivalent of yelling, heads up. But not everyone heeded the warning. Records from cities near castles describe pedestrians being drenched by unpleasant showers, and some unlucky souls even filed lawsuits over ruined clothing. The stench alone could be overpowering, especially in summer when heat turned castle interiors into sweltering breeding grounds for flies and disease. Yet chamber pots reveal more than just medieval hygiene habits. They expose the ingenuity and social hierarchies of castle life. Wealthy nobles might own pots with lids or even decorative designs, while servants made do with shared, unadorned vessels. Some castles had designated garderobes, small rooms with stone seats and chutes that funneled waste into moats or pits. But even these were far from private. Many were built into castle walls with multiple seats, turning bathroom breaks into communal affairs. The real surprise, chamber pots weren't just tolerated, they were normalized. Castles smelled of sweat, smoke, and spoiled food, so adding waste to the mix barely registered as unusual. Servants tasked with emptying pots held some of the least enviable jobs, yet their work kept daily life functioning. And while we might cringe at the thought, this system persisted for centuries because it worked with the technology of the time. The next time you flush a toilet, spare a thought for medieval castle dwellers who turned a basic human need into a public, perilous, and pungent affair. Contrary to popular belief, medieval castles weren't just fortresses of filth. They were places where cleanliness held surprising importance. While we might imagine nobles caked in grime under layers of heavy clothing, many actually bathed far more frequently than modern stereotypes suggest. Castles often featured dedicated bathing chambers, sometimes with elaborate wooden tubs lined with linen to prevent splinters. These weren't the quick, functional showers of today, but leisurely affairs, especially for the wealthy. A noble's bath might involve servants hauling dozens of buckets of heated water, often scented with lavender, rose petals, or expensive imported spices like cloves. The process was almost ceremonial. A lord or lady might bathe while conducting business, receiving visitors, or even during important negotiations. Records describe baths lasting hours, with attendants adding hot water to maintain the temperature. Some castles even had intricate plumbing systems that channeled spring water directly to the bathing chambers, a luxury rivaling Roman bathhouses. The wealthy used fine soaps made from olive oil and ashes, while common castle dwellers made do with rougher lye soaps that doubled as laundry cleaners. But here's where medieval hygiene gets truly surprising. Public bathhouses thrived in castle towns. These weren't the dark, seedy places we might imagine, but bustling social hubs where people from all walks of life gathered. Towns near major castles often had multiple bathhouses, some even offering food, drink, and entertainment alongside bathing. Patrons would soak in large communal tubs, scrubbing each other's backs and sharing news as steam curled around wooden ceilings. Far from being taboo, these spaces were considered essential for health and community bonding. Yet medieval cleanliness had its limits. Without modern understanding of germs, even the most fastidious nobles relied on questionable practices. The same lord who enjoyed weekly herbal baths might believe that wearing a pomander full of rotting meat would ward off plague. Servants reused bathwater in strict hierarchy: lords first, then ladies, then knights, all the way down to kitchen staff. And while castles had latrines, they often emptied directly into moats where, ironically, the same water might later be used for washing. What emerges is a nuanced picture of medieval hygiene, neither the unwashed barbarism of legend nor the sparkling cleanliness of modern times. Bathing was a social ritual, a status symbol, and sometimes even a political tool. When a visiting diplomat was offered a scented bath upon arrival, it wasn't just about cleanliness, it was a display of the host's wealth and refinement. The next time you see a medieval film where everyone looks permanently grimy, remember, those castle dwellers might have been more familiar with rosewater than we give them credit for. Beneath the castle's soaring towers and grand halls, hidden behind thick stone walls, the kitchen hummed with a different kind of energy, one part bustling workshop, one part survival zone. This wasn't just where meals were made, it was a pressure cooker of peril where a single misstep could mean disaster. Picture a cavernous room dominated by a fireplace large enough to roast an entire ox, its flames licking at spits heavy with sizzling meats. Cauldrons the size of wagon wheels bubbled with stews, suspended over fires so intense they could blister skin from across the room, and everywhere the relentless heat. Even in winter, kitchen workers sweltered in tunics soaked through with sweat, their faces flushed from hours bent over open flames. The dangers were as varied as the dishes. Spilled boiling liquid scalded unprotected arms. Grease fires erupted without warning, sending cooks scrambling to douse flames with sand or wet cloths. Knives sharpened to razor edges for butchering slipped in blood-slicked hands, and then there were the burns, constant, inevitable burns. With no modern insulation or safety gear, kitchen staff developed a grim resilience. Records from castle account books list regular payments for salves and bandages, with line items like, "for the cook's burned hands," appearing as routinely as flour or salt. But here's what made these workers truly remarkable: their precision in chaos. Despite the hazards, they produced feasts of staggering complexity. A single banquet might require roasting 20 swans, deboning 100 herrings, and crafting elaborate sugar sculptures, all without thermometers, timers, or standardized measurements. Cooks relied on instinct, testing meat doneness by fingertip or judging oven heat by how long they could bear to hold a hand near the flames. The kitchen's hierarchy mirrored the castle's strict social order, from the master cook, who might wear a chain of office like a nobleman, down to the scullions, children as young as 8 who scrubbed pots until their fingers cracked. And yet, for all their skill, kitchen staff lived in a world of paradox. They handled food fit for kings but often ate scraps. They worked in filth, yet were expected to keep their hands scrupulously clean when touching ingredients. Some castles even had rules forbidding cooks from tasting dishes with their fingers, enforcing the use of spoons, a rare nod to hygiene in an era when most ate with their hands. The kitchen's isolation was deliberate, too. Located far from the Great Hall to contain fire risks, its workers toiled in near invisibility, their labor acknowledged only when something went wrong. Perhaps the greatest testament to their endurance lies in what they left behind, not just recipes but innovations. Castle kitchens birthed techniques we still use today, from slow roasting meats on rotating spits to the early use of ice houses for preserving food. They were the testing grounds for spices arriving from distant lands, where cinnamon and pepper transformed from exotic luxuries to pantry staples. So the next time you picture a medieval feast, don't just imagine the lords at the high table. Spare a thought for the hands that made it possible. Their burns and blisters were the hidden price of every extravagant bite. Imagine a noble unwrapping a tiny parcel with the care usually reserved for gold, because to them, that's exactly what it was. Inside, a handful of black peppercorns worth more than a week's wages for a skilled laborer. In medieval castles, spices weren't just ingredients, they were power, prestige, and sometimes even political currency. While we casually sprinkle pepper on our meals today, in the Middle Ages, owning a chest of exotic spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, or saffron was like having a vault of diamonds. Lords would display them prominently at feasts, not just to season dishes, but to dazzle guests with visible proof of their far-reaching trade connections and deep coffers. The lengths taken to protect these treasures would put modern security systems to shame. Spices were stored in locked chests, often kept in the lord's private chambers or guarded cellars. Keys were held by trusted stewards, and account books meticulously recorded every pinch used, not just to prevent theft, but because wasting a single ounce of saffron, which required 75,000 hand-picked crocus flowers to produce just 1 pound, was unthinkable. Some nobles even included specific spices in their wills, bequeathing them like family jewels to heirs. But the obsession with spices went beyond flaunting wealth. It was also about survival. Without refrigeration, meat could turn questionable within days, especially in warmer months. Enter spices like cloves and ginger, whose strong flavors could mask the taste of meat past its prime. This wasn't deception, it was common practice, openly acknowledged in cookbooks of the time. Recipes instructed cooks to amend older meats with extra pepper or cinnamon, turning potential waste into edible, even desirable dishes. What's truly fascinating is how these humble seeds and barks shaped history. The spice trade forged alliances between kingdoms, funded wars, and even inspired voyages that would later circle the globe. When a noble served spiced wine at a feast, they weren't just offering a drink, they were showcasing their access to a network, stretching from Venetian merchants to faraway lands most guests would never see. And if you think modern food trends are extravagant, consider the medieval lord who served a peacock roasted in its feathers, then draped in gold leaf and seasoned with enough imported spice to buy a small farm. Yet spices also reveal a darker side of castle life. While nobles indulged in flavors from across the known world, commoners made do with local herbs like parsley or thyme, if they had seasoning at all. The spice trade's astronomical costs meant that for most castle dwellers, even a whiff of cinnamon was a rare luxury. This divide wasn't just about taste, it was a physical reminder of who held power. When a noble's breath carried the scent of distant lands, it whispered a clear message. They moved in circles far beyond the castle walls, so the next time you reach for that ordinary pepper shaker, pause. What's now a kitchen staple was once a treasure, one that built empires, disguised culinary dangers, and turned medieval meals into edible theater. Every pinch was a story of adventure, ingenuity, and the relentless human desire to turn necessity into extravagance. Imagine cresting a hill in the Middle Ages, expecting to see yet another drab grey fortress, only to be met with a shocking burst of color. That's the reality modern ruins don't show us. Medieval castles weren't just functional strongholds, they were dazzling status symbols painted in hues that could rival a king's robe. Vibrant reds, gleaming whites, and even gold leaf once covered their walls, turning these structures into beacons of power visible for miles. The choice of colors wasn't arbitrary, it was psychological warfare. A crimson tower wasn't just beautiful, it screamed dominance, its boldness declaring the owner's wealth and confidence. Whitewash, made from expensive lime, signaled purity and divine favor, while gold accents shimmering in sunlight literally made the castle appear touched by the heavens. These weren't mere decorations, they were calculated displays meant to intimidate rivals and impress subjects. A traveler approaching a castle like Rochester in England might have gasped at its scarlet towers streaked with white, colors so vivid they seemed to bleed into the landscape. But creating these hues required astonishing effort. Red pigment often came from iron oxide mined at great cost, while bright whites needed endless buckets of lime hauled up scaffolding by laborers. Gold leaf application was a painstaking process, with artisans carefully adhering fragile sheets to surfaces, knowing a single gust of wind could ruin hours of work. The paints weren't just for show either, they protected the stone from weathering, making their eventual fading over centuries a double loss. What's truly fascinating is how these colors shaped medieval politics. When King Henry III ordered his castle walls repainted, in the manner of our beloved Westminster, it wasn't vanity, it was propaganda, visually linking his rule to sacred spaces. Rebellious barons sometimes deliberately whitewashed captured castles to symbolically cleanse them of their previous owners' influence. Even the church got involved, with bishops insisting cathedral-style colors for certain fortresses to emphasize divine authority over military might. Today, we're left with ghostly hints of this vanished brilliance. Weather and time have stripped most castles back to bare stone, but forensic archaeologists have uncovered traces of pigment in crevices and carvings. At Conway Castle in Wales, faint red streaks still cling to window recesses, while Dover's Keep reveals patches of once gleaming whitewash under ultraviolet light. These echoes remind us that medieval life wasn't just functional, it was unapologetically bold. A world where power wasn't just held, but flaunted in every brushstroke. So the next time you visit a castle and assume its grey monotony reflects the Middle Ages, think again. Those now muted stones were once a riot of color, their hues as much a weapon as the arrows in their armories. The real surprise isn't that they were painted, it's that we ever imagined them any other way. Dogs didn't just roam castle courtyards, they ruled them. While we picture medieval hounds as fierce hunting companions or snarling guardians, their roles stretched far beyond duty. These animals were confidants, healers, and even fashion statements, woven into the fabric of castle life in ways that might surprise you. Take the Lord's favorite greyhound, for instance, sleek and silent. It might sprawl across his feet during council meetings, its presence a silent reminder of his wealth and refined tastes. Or the mastiffs that patrolled the kitchens, their massive frames deterring thieves, but also nuzzling scullions for scraps when the stew pots ran low. The bond between nobles and their dogs often blurred the lines between pet and status symbol. Wealthy families imported exotic breeds like the tiny spaniels bred for ladies' laps, their silky coats meticulously groomed with combs made of ivory or bone. Records from castle inventories list jeweled collars and embroidered blankets specifically for dogs, luxuries many human servants never enjoyed. Some hounds even had their own servants. The Earl of Warwick's account books mention a dedicated keeper of the king's hounds, paid handsomely to ensure the pack was fed fresh meat and exercised daily. Yet dogs weren't just aristocratic accessories, they were medieval multitaskers. Hunting breeds like bloodhounds tracked game through dense forests, their baying voices guiding riders through fog or darkness. Guard dogs patrolled castle gates with an intuition that often outpaced human sentries. Their barks could distinguish between a drunken reveler and an intruder scaling the walls. Even the lowly turnspit dog, a now extinct breed, had its niche. These small, sturdy canines trotted endlessly on wooden wheels to rotate roasting meat over fires, their paws blackened by years of pacing over hot coals. What's most revealing, though, is how dogs transcended their practical roles. Personal letters between nobles mention grieving over lost pets, with one knight writing of his spaniel's death. "I weep more for him than I did for my second son." Tomb effigies sometimes depict ladies with their tiny dogs curled at their feet, a tender nod to companionship that outlasted even death. And then there's the curious case of Guinefort, a greyhound venerated as a saint in parts of France after allegedly sacrificing itself to save a noble's child from a snake. This deep connection wasn't without its quirks. Medieval veterinarians prescribed bizarre remedies for ailing dogs, everything from powdered stag antler for weak limbs to wine-soaked bread for indigestion. Some nobles believed their hounds could detect treachery. Accounts describe dogs growling at certain guests, prompting hosts to discreetly increase security. And while cats were often mistrusted as witches' familiars, dogs enjoyed near-universal affection, their loyalty celebrated in tapestries and poetry. So the next time you see a medieval painting with a dog in the corner, don't dismiss it as mere decoration. That tail-wagging figure might have been a hunter, a heater, a therapist, and a treasured friend, all rolled into one furry, panting package. In castles where human alliances shifted like the wind, dogs offered something rare and precious, unconditional love in a world built on conditions. While knights and lords dominate most medieval tales, castles had another kind of ruler, one who wielded power not with a sword but with a set of keys. When the lord rode off to war or court, the castle didn't pause. It pivoted to the steady hands of his lady. Far from being a decorative figurehead, the noblewoman transformed into a commander, diplomat, and CEO overnight. Those heavy iron keys hanging at her belt weren't just symbols, they unlocked every storeroom, treasury, and granary, marking her as the undeniable authority in her husband's absence. Consider the sheer scope of her responsibilities. She reviewed account books line by line, ensuring taxes were collected and servants paid. She arbitrated disputes between villagers, her word carrying the same weight as her husband's. When supplies ran low during a siege, she decided who ate and who went hungry. Some noblewomen even mastered the art of defensive strategy, like Nicolas de la Haye, who famously commanded Lincoln Castle's resistance against French invaders in her 70s, outmaneuvering seasoned knights with her tactics. The lady's influence extended beyond crisis management. She was the castle's chief cultural officer, commissioning tapestries that told family legends or hosting musicians to bolster the household's reputation. Her chambers often doubled as a business hub, where stewards delivered harvest reports and merchants negotiated contracts under her sharp-eyed scrutiny. And let's not forget the less glamorous tasks: inspecting cheese wheels for mold, approving linen repairs, or mediating kitchen squabbles that could disrupt the entire household. What's most revealing is how these women navigated a world that officially denied them power. They couldn't inherit titles in many regions, yet they routinely governed vast estates. They were excluded from combat, yet they orchestrated sieges. Some, like Elena of Aquitaine, turned their managerial roles into political dynasties, schooling their daughters in the same intricate dance of diplomacy and defense. Their letters, often preserved in castle archives, show minds as strategic as any generals, peppered with coded phrases and subtle alliances. The irony. While history books glorify kings and conquerors, it was often these noblewomen who kept the lights burning. Their ledgers recorded every candle used in the chapel, every bolt of cloth traded at the fair. They knew which guards could be bribed and which cooks could stretch a meager pantry into a feast. And when their husbands returned, they didn't just hand over the keys, they provided detailed briefings that shaped the lord's next moves. So the next time you see a medieval tapestry depicting a lady with her spindle, look closer. Those seemingly idle hands were likely calculating budgets, drafting troop movements, or holding a castle together against all odds. In a world that measured power by the sword, these women proved the pen and the ledger could be mightier still. In the echoing halls of a medieval castle, childhood wasn't a time of carefree play, it was an apprenticeship for life, starting shockingly early. Picture a noble's 7-year-old son, barely tall enough to grasp a practice sword, already standing straight-backed in the courtyard as a grizzled knight critiques his posture. Or a girl of the same age, her small hands carefully folding linens under the watchful eye of the castle's chatelaine, learning to distinguish Flanders wool from English broadcloth by touch alone. These weren't future responsibilities, they were daily realities. While modern children memorize multiplication tables, their medieval counterparts were mastering skills that could mean the difference between a dynasty's survival and its collapse. For noble boys, training began with a jarring transition, being sent away from home as young as 7 to serve as a page in another lord's household. This wasn't abandonment, but a calculated strategy. Separated from familial coddling, they absorbed harsh lessons in obedience and endurance. By day, they polished armor, delivered messages, and practiced horsemanship. By night, they attended to guests at table. Their clumsy first attempts at carving meat or pouring wine met with sharp corrections. Every menial task had purpose. Carrying heavy buckets built strength for future combat, while memorizing heraldic symbols honed the observational skills needed on chaotic battlefields. Girls, though usually spared from being sent away, faced equally demanding curricula within their own castles. Under the ladies' tutelage, they mastered the intricate dance of household management, a role far more complex than modern homemaking. At 9 or 10, a noble daughter might already be tallying grain stores or supervising the preserving of fruits for winter. Her education included reading often in multiple languages for border region nobility, herbal medicine, and even basic legal training to oversee tenant disputes. Physical grace mattered too. Dancing wasn't just entertainment, but a vital skill for future political alliances forged through marriage, the most surprising aspect. How little distinction existed between education and survival. A 12-year-old squire didn't just practice swordplay, he learned to identify the faint creak of leather that signaled a failing saddle strap before a fatal jousting accident. A young lady's embroidery lessons doubled as training in stitching wounds, her delicate floral patterns proving she could suture flesh with equal precision. Even play had purpose. Chess taught battlefield strategy, while falconry instilled patience and the ability to read animal behavior, skills transferable to managing unruly vassals. This relentless preparation reflected a brutal truth: medieval nobles couldn't afford prolonged childhoods. Plague, war, or simple childbirth could abruptly thrust responsibility onto tiny shoulders. Historical records show 8-year-olds inheriting castles, their tutors scrambling to teach diplomacy before neighboring lords smelled weakness. Some rose to the challenge astonishingly well, like the 12-year-old countess who negotiated her own marriage contract, or the boy king who led armies at 14. Yet glimpses of normalcy peek through the rigor. Archaeologists find worn wooden tops and dolls in castle corners, proof that even these miniature adults snatched moments of play. Chroniclers mention young squires sneaking sweets from the kitchen or girls bribing stable boys to let them pet newborn puppies, the most poignant detail. Scribbled notes in Latin textbooks where bored students doodled knights or flowers in the margins, a timeless reminder that behind the discipline, they were still children. What emerges isn't just a story of hardship, but of extraordinary adaptability. These children didn't just endure their training, they internalized it, becoming fluent in power dynamics before modern kids learn to ride bikes. Their classrooms had no walls, their lessons no end, because in a castle, every moment was preparation for the day the keep's weight would rest on their shoulders. The real marvel isn't that they grew up so fast, but that they grew up at all. When the castle gates swung open for a minstrel, it wasn't just music that walked in, it was the medieval equivalent of a breaking news alert. These wandering performers carried more than lutes and tambourines. Their satchels bulged with the most valuable currency of the age: information. A well-traveled minstrel might arrive humming a tune about a distant battle's outcome, then casually drop details about harvest failures 3 counties over between verses. Lords leaned in closer during these performances than they did during council meetings, because every lyric held potential intelligence, that cheerful ballad about a knight's bravery. It might secretly mock a rival noble's recent blunder, with coded references only the savvy would catch. The best minstrels operated like roving journalists with perfect recall. Without paper to jot down notes, they memorized everything from the size of a duke's army to the terms of a secret betrothal, and repackaged it as catchy rhymes. Their songs became the medieval version of viral posts, spreading from castle to tavern to marketplace with startling speed. Some were even employed as official messengers, their musicians' guise allowing them to cross enemy lines unchallenged. Records show kings paying minstrels not just for entertainment, but for tidings of the north or news from beyond the sea. But this influence came with risks. A minstrel who sang too warmly about the wrong lord might find himself banned from certain territories. Others faced accusations of spying, their instruments searched for hidden documents. The smartest ones mastered the art of plausible deniability, phrasing gossip as hypotheticals or framing criticism as ancient fables. Their survival depended on reading rooms instantly. A verse that delighted one audience could enrage another. What's most fascinating is how their role blurred social lines. Though often of humble birth, a talented minstrel might dine at the high table one night and sleep in the stables the next. They moved fluidly between worlds, collecting secrets from drunk guards and lonely ladies alike. Some became trusted confidants, like the minstrel who documented Elena of Aquitaine's court and subtly championed her political maneuvers through song. Their legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Many folk songs we consider timeless classics actually began as medieval propaganda, crafted to turn public opinion against unpopular taxes or foreign wars. The next time you hear an old ballad, listen closer. Those seemingly simple verses might be the tweets of their day, carrying messages that once shaped kingdoms. That innocuous little closet tucked into the castle wall, it was medieval multitasking at its most pungent. The garderobe, a deceptively simple alcove, served two vital functions that would make modern homeowners blanch. By day, it housed the lord's finest tunics and furs, protecting them from moths with an all-natural repellent, the ammonia-rich fumes rising from the privy chute below. By night, it transformed into the castle's most exclusive toilet, where nobles could attend to private needs while their robes absorbed the distinctive atmosphere. This wasn't just clever space saving, it was biological warfare against fabric-eating insects, leveraging human waste as an accidental pest control system. The engineering behind these dual-purpose rooms reveals medieval ingenuity. A stone seat with a carefully carved hole perched over a vertical shaft, sometimes angling slightly outward to prevent climbers from using it to invade the castle. Waste plummeted down this dark tunnel, either collecting in a cesspit at the base of the wall or more dramatically plopping straight into the moat. At some castles like Dover, archaeologists have found layers of compacted waste 30 feet deep at the base of garderobe shafts, a testament to centuries of use. The wealthiest nobles might have private garderobes lined with wood or even cushioned seats, while others made do with shared facilities where multiple holes allowed for communal use. But the garderobe's legacy lingers in our language. The word wardrobe evolved from this very space, a nod to its original role as clothing storage. Those who could afford multiple outfits would rotate them through the garderobe, letting the fumes deter moths between wearings. Some castles took this further, building entire robe rooms where dozens of garments hung above privy shafts, creating a constant circulation of moth-repelling air. Ironically, the system-worked textiles stored in garderobes show significantly less insect damage in surviving medieval collections than those kept elsewhere. Yet these conveniences came with risks. Poorly designed chutes could backflow odors into living quarters, turning whole sections of the castle unbearable in summer. More horrifying, some shafts were wide enough for rats to climb, leading to occasional nighttime surprises. There are even accounts of besiegers attempting to infiltrate castles through garderobes, though the narrow, slick passages and sudden drops made this a perilous strategy. One Welsh castle's records mention an unlucky invader who became stuck in a chute mid-attempt, his fate left unrecorded but easy to imagine. What's most fascinating is how the garderobe reflects medieval attitudes toward privacy and practicality. Unlike today's sealed, sanitized bathrooms, these were unapologetically functional spaces where bodily functions coexisted with daily life. Servants might deliver messages to nobles mid-use, and some garderobes featured small shelves for candles or books. At Château-Gaillard in France, archaeologists found evidence of a garderobe with a chessboard carved into its seat, proof that even castle dwellers knew how to multitask. So the next time you casually say you're hanging something in the wardrobe, remember its origins. That humble closet owes its name to an era when luxury meant having a private place to both store your silks and, well, let's just say the modern walk-in closet has come a long way. The garderobe stands as a testament to medieval creativity, where necessity didn't just breed invention, but occasionally a whiff of unintended genius. Climbing a medieval castle staircase might seem like a simple task until you realize each step was a calculated death trap. Those iconic spiral staircases weren't just architectural flourishes, they were cunning psychological and physical weapons disguised in stone. Picture an attacker charging upward, sword in hand, only to find his right arm pinned against the central column while defenders above strike downward with lethal precision. This wasn't an accident, it was geometry wielded like a blade, with every twist and turn engineered to give the home team an insurmountable edge. The secret lies in the clockwise spin. Over 90% of medieval fighters were right-handed, meaning their sword arms would be obstructed by the curve's tight inner wall as they ascended. Defenders, meanwhile, could swing freely from their higher position, using the outer curve's wider arc to build momentum for crushing blows. Even the steps themselves were weapons irregularly spaced and often slightly sloped to disrupt an invader's rhythm. Some castles took this further, carving tiny grooves into the outer edges where defenders could plant their heels for stability while attackers stumbled on the uneven surface. But the brilliance didn't stop at combat mechanics. These staircases acted like medieval security cameras, funneling invaders into single-file lines where their numbers meant nothing. The narrow confines prevented shield walls from forming, while the spiraling darkness obscured how many defenders waited above. At Rochester Castle, the keep's staircase even features a murder hole halfway up, a hidden gap where defenders could drop stones or boiling liquid onto trapped assailants. What's most fascinating is how this design persisted across centuries and cultures, from Welsh border forts to Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land. Builders tweaked the formula. Some stairs had alternating tall and short steps to trip up armored foes, while others included deceptive, blind steps that appeared solid until weight made them collapse. Even left-handed builders adhered to the clockwise rule, proving how deeply this tactical wisdom was ingrained. Yet these staircases reveal more than military genius. They expose the medieval mind's obsession with layered defense. A castle's walls might stop an army, but its stairs could neutralize champions. That seemingly mundane climb from the kitchen to the Great Hall, it was a final failsafe, ensuring that even if enemies breached the gates, they'd face one last gauntlet where every step favored the defenders. Today, as tourists grip the rope handrails added for safety, they're unwittingly retracing the path that doomed countless medieval attackers, one cleverly designed step at a time. When danger loomed, whether raiders cresting the horizon or rumors of approaching armies, the castle gates didn't just open for knights and nobles. They swung wide for the very people who spent most days toiling in the fields, peasants clutching children, herding livestock, and hauling whatever meager possessions they could carry. This wasn't charity, it was a calculated exchange. The Lord provided shelter within the castle walls, and in return, the villagers reinforced his legitimacy as their protector, a dynamic as old as feudalism itself. The scenes during these crises would have been chaotic yet orderly. Families crammed into the outer bailey, their animals penned in makeshift enclosures to prevent stampedes. The castle's normally pristine courtyards transformed into makeshift refugee camps, buzzing with the smells of unwashed bodies and the constant cries of infants. Servants distributed thin gruel from the kitchens while guards kept watch for both external threats and internal tensions. Peasants weren't permitted in the keep's hallowed halls. Of course, social hierarchies held even in emergencies. but the very act of sheltering them created a fragile bond between the stone fortress and the thatch-roofed homes beyond its walls. What's often overlooked is how these moments of crisis became performances of power. A lord who welcomed his people during siege season, however begrudgingly, earned their loyalty far more effectively than one who merely collected taxes. Chronicles describe nobles personally overseeing the distribution of bread during particularly dire times, a calculated display of benevolence. Some castles even had designated crisis protocols, with specific areas for different village families and systems for rationing water from the well. The unspoken message was clear: the castle wasn't just a symbol of authority, but a literal lifeline, yet this protection came with strings attached. Peasants allowed inside were expected to contribute. Men might be pressed into reinforcing defenses, while women and children carded wool or stitched arrow bags. Their animals weren't safe either. Cows and sheep often became emergency rations for the garrison, and when the danger passed, everyone was swiftly sent home, sometimes with a token of appreciation like a day's extra bread, but never with the illusion that castle life was theirs to share long-term. The practice reveals a deeper truth about medieval society's contradictions. For all the stark divisions between noble and peasant, castle and village, their fates were inextricably linked. A lord who failed to protect his people risked rebellion or, worse, a workforce too decimated to plant next season's crops. Likewise, peasants who burned their lord's castle during peacetime might regret it when the next band of marauders appeared. This uneasy interdependence turned the castle into more than a military stronghold. It became the beating heart of a fragile social contract, where safety was both a privilege and a carefully meted-out bargaining chip. Archaeological evidence hints at how these brief cohabitations left their mark. Excavations at castles like Framlingham in England uncovered peasant artifacts mixed with noble debris, a child's wooden toy near the barracks, or a farmer's leather shoe buckle in the stables. These accidental time capsules remind us that castles weren't isolated fortresses, but nodes in a living network of survival. The next time you see a castle's outer walls, imagine them not just repelling invaders, but briefly embracing the very people who made the lord's wealth possible, then just as firmly shutting them out when the threat had passed. In an age before printing presses, books weren't just rare. They were masterpieces of labor and devotion, each one a small fortune bound between leather covers. Imagine a noble unwrapping a newly acquired manuscript, its pages shimmering with gold leaf and vibrant pigments that seemed to glow from within. These weren't mere books, they were wearable wealth, often chained to lecterns to prevent theft, their value rivaling that of a knight's armor or a merchant's ship. The creation of a single illuminated manuscript could take years, with teams of scribes and artists laboring over every stroke of ink and brush. Monks in secluded scriptoria bent over parchment made from calfskin, their hands steady as they copied sacred texts in precise, unbroken lines. The most lavish editions featured intricate borders crawling with mythical beasts, while capital letters blossomed into miniature paintings depicting biblical scenes or the lives of saints. But why such extravagance for something we'd now toss in a backpack? In a world where literacy was a privilege, books symbolized divine and earthly power. A lord who displayed a psalter with jeweled covers wasn't just showing off his wealth, he was aligning himself with the sacred, proving his piety and sophistication. Some manuscripts even served as diplomatic tools. Gifting a beautifully illustrated gospel book could secure alliances more effectively than a chest of gold. The Winchester Bible, for instance, stretches over 500 pages, each folio a testament to the political and spiritual ambitions of its patron. The process behind these treasures was astonishingly complex. Pigments came from crushed gemstones, insects, and even toxic minerals like lapis lazuli, imported at great cost from Afghanistan. Gold leaf was applied with such precision that it catches light centuries later as if still wet. Mistakes weren't merely corrected, they became art. A botched line might morph into a whimsical doodle in the margin, like a monk's quiet rebellion against perfection. What's often overlooked is how these books were used. They weren't kept pristine on shelves but handled daily, prayed over, read aloud in great halls, or passed around as visual aids during sermons. The wear on their pages tells stories of devotion, thumbprints darkening favorite psalms, wine stains marking festive readings. Some nobles commissioned personal prayer books small enough to tuck into a sleeve, their intimate scale belying their staggering cost. Yet the true power of illuminated manuscripts lay in their duality. They were both sacred objects and status symbols, tools of worship and weapons of politics. A monastery might produce a Bible to honor God, while a queen like Helena of Aquitaine collected romances to showcase her education. In an era when most people encountered texts only through public readings, owning books, especially lavishly decorated ones, wasn't just literacy. It was a form of control over knowledge itself. Today, as we swipe through endless digital pages, these medieval masterpieces remind us that books were once artifacts of wonder. Each one carried not just words, but the weight of human hands, faith, and ambition, a luminous bridge between heaven and the sharp, inked reality of medieval life. Chess wasn't just a game in medieval castles, it was war by other means. Those exquisitely carved ivory pieces gliding across checkered boards weren't mere decorations. They were battlefield simulators disguised as noble entertainment. Picture a young knight in training hunched over a chessboard, his tutor pointing out how the knight's L-shaped move mimicked cavalry flanking maneuvers, or how sacrificing a pawn could open lines of attack just like thinning enemy ranks with archers. Every match was a silent lesson in strategy where the consequences of a bad move meant nothing more than toppled pieces rather than actual bloodshed. The finest chess sets were works of art that revealed their owner's status. Kings commissioned sets with jeweled crowns for the queens and miniature armored warhorses for the knights. Some nobles even carried portable folding boards when traveling, their pieces crafted from walrus ivory or ebony so dark it seemed to swallow the light. The famous Lewis chessmen, discovered in Scotland, show the whimsical side of these sets. Some bishops grip their crosiers with comically exaggerated scowls, while rooks bite their shields like berserkers mid-battle. These weren't just playing pieces, they were conversation starters, political tools, and sometimes even peace offerings between rival houses. What made chess uniquely suited to castle life was how it mirrored medieval social hierarchy. The king moved slowly but commanded absolute loyalty. The queen, though initially the weakest piece, gained tremendous power as the game evolved, much like real noblewomen's influence. Pawns represented the common folk, expendable yet capable of reaching the enemy's back rank and transforming into something greater. Young nobles absorbed these unspoken lessons while playing, internalizing the feudal order with every match. But chess had its controversies too. Some church officials condemned it as a distraction from prayer, while others saw it as training for the mind. Records show knights being punished for skipping mass to play, and one bishop famously smashed a chessboard over a nobleman's head during a particularly heated game. The game's Persian origins also made it exotic, with early European sets featuring elephants instead of bishops, reflecting its journey along trade routes. The true brilliance of medieval chess lay in its duality. It was both pastime and pedagogy, art object and strategic drill. a lord could demonstrate his cunning to visiting diplomats over a leisurely game, while his squires learned patience and foresight between matches. Even the board itself held symbolic weight, the alternating black and white squares representing the constant struggle between opposing forces, much like the delicate balance of power that kept castle life intact. So the next time you see a medieval chess set in a museum, look beyond the carved figures. Those silent pieces once taught kings how to rule and knights how to survive. The castle chapel wasn't just another room, it was the spiritual compass guiding every hour of medieval life. While we might picture grand cathedrals when thinking of medieval worship, the humbler castle chapels were where nobles and servants alike lived their faith in quiet, daily rituals. From the moment the chapel bell rang at dawn, calling the household to prime, until compline prayers signaled bedtime, this sacred space pulsed with rhythm and reverence. The Lord might strategize wars in the great hall and feast in the solar, but here, on cold stone kneelers, he was just another soul seeking grace. What's easily overlooked is how these chapels mirrored the castle's social hierarchy. The noble family occupied carved stalls near the altar, while servants stood in the rear, yet both recited the same Latin verses. The chaplain, often one of the few literate members of the household, wielded subtle influence, interpreting scripture in ways that could sway political decisions. Some chapels even doubled as classrooms where children learned psalms alongside their letters, the rhythms of faith and language intertwining. The chapel's design reveals its dual purpose. Thick walls muffled secular noise, creating an oasis of calm, but arrow slits disguised as windows hinted at its defensive role during sieges. At Warkworth Castle, the Earl's private chapel had a discreet side door allowing quick access from his chambers, a tangible reminder that spiritual and worldly power walked hand in hand. Even the artwork served multiple masters. Vibrant frescoes of saints inspired devotion while subtly reinforcing the Lord's lineage through strategically placed family crests. Daily Mass was non-negotiable, but the chapel's true magic lay in its quieter moments. A knight might linger after prayers to run his fingers over a loved one's tomb effigy. Scullions sneaked in at odd hours to light cheap tallow candles before shrines, bargaining with saints for better treatment from the cook. The smell of beeswax and incense clung to woolen tunics long after services ended, a sensory reminder that piety permeated every corner of castle life. This relentless devotion wasn't just about salvation, it was social glue. When harvests failed or plague struck, processions wound through the castle with relics held high, uniting everyone from stable boys to the lady herself in shared hope. The chapel's calendar structured the entire year, from Lenten fasts that emptied the larders to Christmas feasts that temporarily blurred class lines. Even the chapel's location spoke volumes. Placed near the Great Hall, it ensured no one could enter the Lord's presence without passing reminders of divine judgment. Yet these sacred walls witnessed very human dramas. Chronicles tell of nobles bribing chaplains to shorten sermons, and of illicit trysts behind the choir screen. At Pontefract Castle, archaeologists found gaming dice hidden under floorboards near the altar, proof that even in God's house, medieval people remained gloriously, imperfectly human. The chapel stood as both refuge and stage, where eternal truths collided with daily frailties, and where every whispered prayer carried the weight of a world balancing between heaven and earth. The court jester's cap with its jingling bells wasn't just a costume, it was the only armor he had in the most dangerous arena of all, the Lord's temper. These quick-witted performers danced on a razor's edge, where one brilliantly barbed joke could earn them a gold coin or a knight in the stocks. Behind the cartwheels and exaggerated grimaces lay a perilous truth. jesters were the only people in the castle who could mock the powerful to their faces, provided they made them laugh instead of reaching for their swords. Take the infamous case of Raha, jester to King Henry I. When the king grew arrogant about his military victories, Raha didn't flatter. He handed him a child's toy sword during a feast, quipping, "Since you've conquered everything, perhaps you'd like to start again from the beginning." The stunned silence that followed could have ended his career or his life. Instead, the king's booming laughter turned Raha into a legend. This was the jester's high-stakes art, wrapping uncomfortable truths in humor so sharp it drew blood before anyone noticed. The best jesters mastered a secret language. Their rhymes and riddles delivered political commentary too dangerous to state plainly. When taxes grew oppressive, a clever jester might perform a skit about greedy badgers stealing from rabbit burrows, letting peasants cheer while the lord absorbed the message. Some even served as unofficial diplomats, using mock battles between costumed puppets to symbolize conflicts between rival nobles, subtly suggesting compromises through satire. But the risks were real. Chronicles mention jesters whipped for jokes that hit too close to home, or banished for mocking the wrong noble's vanity. At Stirling Castle, one jester reportedly lost his tongue after comparing his lord's hunting skills to a blind man threading a needle. Yet paradoxically, this vulnerability was their strength. A jester's apparent harmlessness, his motley clothes and childlike bells, created a psychological shield. Attacking him would make a lord seem thin-skinned, so most endured the barbs with forced smiles. What's often forgotten is how much intelligence this role required. The finest jesters weren't just funny, they were keen observers of human nature, studying their patrons' moods like physicians taking pulses. They knew when to tease about boldness, safe, versus infidelity, potentially fatal, when physical comedy would land better than wordplay, and crucially, when to disappear for a few days after a particularly pointed jest. Their costumes hid another advantage. Those oversized sleeves could conceal anything from emergency sweetmeats to placate an angry lord, to notes passed between conspiring nobles. The jester's legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Modern political cartoons and late-night comedy owe a debt to these medieval truth-tellers who proved humor could be both weapon and shield. Their ghosts still whisper through castle halls, reminders that in a world where free speech was non-existent for most, laughter sometimes carved out the only space for honesty. That jingling cap wasn't just announcing a performance, it was a warning bell for power, signaling that even kings weren't beyond reproach when the joke was sharp enough. Winter in a medieval castle wasn't just chilly. It was an annual battle for survival where every breath hung visible in the air and frost painted intricate patterns on the inside of windows. While we might complain about a drafty room today, imagine stone walls so cold they made your fingertips stick, or waking to find your blanket stiff with frozen condensation. The Great Hall's massive fireplace might roar with flames, but just a few yards away, servants huddled in unheated corridors could see their breath-form clouds as they worked. This was life in a season that didn't just inconvenience castle dwellers, it reshaped their entire existence from October to April. The wealthy had their tricks against the cold. Lords and ladies slept under bearskins or layered fox fur blankets, while tapestries lining the walls did more than display wealth, their thick wool trapped precious heat. Some nobles even had heated stone benches built over discreet channels where servants could push hot coals from the kitchen below, but the real luxury. Portable brass braziers filled with smoldering charcoal, carried from room to room like ancient space heaters. Records from Durham Castle list payments for 4 pounds of ginger for warming drinks, and quilted hangings for the lady's bed, small comforts that made winter bearable for the elite. For everyone else, winter was a gauntlet of misery. Kitchen staff might work inches from blazing ovens while their backs froze from icy drafts sneaking under doors. Guards on night watch wore layered tunics stuffed with straw or dried moss for insulation, their metal helmets lined with wool to prevent frostbite. The castle's poorest residents, scullions, stable boys, and visiting laborers often slept in animal stalls for warmth, burrowing into hay alongside cows and horses whose body heat raised the temperature just enough to survive. The architecture itself conspired against comfort. Those picturesque arrow slits that provided defense in summer became relentless cold funnels in winter, whistling with winds that extinguished candles and sent temperatures plunging. At Knaresborough Castle, archaeologists found evidence of makeshift winter modifications rushes piled knee-deep in corners where servants slept, and soot marks showing where families clustered around temporary fire pits dug into floor recesses. Even the chapel wasn't spared. Priests conducted mass with hands numb around frozen chalices, their breath forming tiny ice crystals on the sacramental wine. Yet winter also forged unexpected bonds. Chronicles describe impromptu gatherings in the kitchens, where servants and minor nobles alike jostled for space near baking ovens after sunset. The season suspended some social norms. A lord might allow his grooms to warm themselves in the great hall after nightfall, or permit children to play dice games by the fire during the darkest months. Food took on new significance. Steaming pottage thickened with barley became a daily lifeline, while spiced wine wasn't just festive but medicinal, its warmth traveling from belly to frozen toes. The true testament to their resilience lies in the innovations born of necessity. Castles in colder regions developed hot rooms, small chambers where heated stones from the kitchen could be stacked under benches, creating early radiant heat. At Framlingham Castle, records show the purchase of hundreds of rabbit skins specifically for winter gloves and ear coverings. Some households employed bed warmers, servants who slid long-handled brass pans filled with coals between sheets before the nobles retired. Perhaps the most poignant winter sight was the castle's breath itself, not just from its inhabitants but from the building. On bitter mornings, the entire structure seemed to exhale as warm air from crowded halls met freezing exteriors, forming a mist that clung to the battlements like a ghostly shroud. It was a visible reminder of the fragile boundary between comfort and calamity, where every log burned and every fur draped represented a small victory against the season's relentless siege. Winter didn't just test medieval endurance, it revealed their ingenuity, proving that even in the age of stone and sword, human warmth, both literal and figurative, was the most precious currency of all. That peculiar little room labeled the Buttery in castle inventories had nothing to do with churning cream. Its real purpose would make any modern wine collector green with envy. Far from storing dairy, this dim, cool chamber was the castle's liquid treasure vault, packed to its arched ceiling with barrels of ale, mead, and imported wines. The name itself comes from the French but, meaning cask, and these wooden vessels held something far more precious than butter, the castle's primary drinking supply. In an era when even clear streams could carry deadly pathogens, alcohol wasn't just for celebration, it was the safest thing on the menu, with even toddlers sipping watered-down, small beer to avoid dysentery. The Buttery's operation reveals medieval ingenuity at its most practical. A dedicated butler, yes, that's where the title originates, oversaw distribution with military precision, doling out daily rations based on rank. Lords received fine Gascony wine, soldiers got hearty ale, and servants made do with the weakest brews. Records from Dover Castle show meticulous accounting, with entries like 3 gallons for the visiting bishop's retinue, or 1 pint per groom at harvest time. Some barrels were even marked with chalk to prevent theft. their levels checked weekly against the steward's ledger, storage methods bordered on alchemy. Barrels were stacked on their sides in stone niches to keep corks moist, while thick walls maintained a constant cellar temperature. At Warwick Castle, archaeologists found a buttery with a clever drainage channel in the floor. Spilled alcohol could be collected and redistributed rather than wasted. The wealthiest castles boasted iron-hooped tuns, giant casks so valuable they were listed separately in wills. One nobleman bequeathed his great Flemish beer tun to his son like a modern CEO passing down a vintage sports car. What's truly astonishing is the scale of consumption. A typical castle might go through 30 gallons of ale per day, not because everyone was drunk, but because brewing killed waterborne bacteria. Workers in the fields received ale breaks instead of water breaks, and school children sipped weak table beer with meals. The alcohol content was negligible, but the boiling process made it safe. Some butlers even added herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow for flavor and additional antibacterial properties, creating medieval energy drinks long before the concept existed. Yet the buttery wasn't just about survival, it was a social engine. The quality of drink served signaled status more blatantly than clothing. A guest handed a cup of Rhenish wine knew they were honored. Those given local cider understood their place. During sieges, the buttery became a strategic reserve, with guards posted to prevent panic-driven looting. At Corfe Castle, defenders reportedly stretched their beer supply during a 3-month siege by mixing it with honey and herbs, creating an improvised mead that kept spirits literally and figuratively high. The legacy of these unassuming rooms lingers in our language and habits. Toast comes from the practice of floating spiced bread in wine to improve its flavor, while bridal derives from bride ale, the celebratory drink at weddings. Next time you visit a castle cellar, look past the empty stone niches. Those worn grooves in the floor weren't from butter churns, but from generations of barrels rolled in and out, keeping a fortress hydrated one carefully measured pint at a time. The leather glove creaked as the lord extended his arm, his eyes locked on the speck circling high above, a peregrine falcon riding the wind like a living piece of the sky itself. In that moment, the bird wasn't just a hunter, it was a feathered extension of noble power, a creature so revered that medieval law placed its value above most horses. Falconry wasn't merely a sport for the elite, it was a complex language of status written in talons and jesses, where the type of bird on your wrist could announce your rank as clearly as a coat of arms. Kings flew majestic gyrfalcons, their white plumage mirroring Arctic snows, while earls might favor the swift saker falcon. Even the humble kestrel, reserved for knaves and servants, carried its own unspoken message about where its handler stood in the rigid feudal order. Training these winged aristocrats was an art verging on alchemy. A master falconer didn't just command birds, he courted them, spending weeks patiently manning a newly captured falcon by keeping it perched on his glove day and night until it accepted him as partner rather than captor. The process was fraught with danger. A startled bird could slice through a gauntlet with its razor-sharp talons, or worse, decide the open sky looked better than service to humans. Success demanded an intimate understanding of avian psychology, knowing when to reward with a scrap of fresh-killed rabbit, when to withhold food to reinforce obedience, and how to read the subtle body language that signaled a bird's mood. The best falconers developed lifelong bonds with their charges, whispering to them in low tones as they stroked their speckled breast feathers. The sheer logistics of medieval falconry would stagger modern animal trainers. Castles maintained elaborate mews with perches sized for each species, their walls painted soothing colors to calm high-strung birds. Hoods of finest Moroccan leather, often embroidered with gold thread, kept falcons calm during transport. Account books from castles like Chateau Gaillard list astonishing expenses: silver bells for tracking birds in dense brush, custom-made gauntlets lined with silk, even payments to falcon physicians who concocted remedies for ailments like crooked beak or moody plumage. Some nobles commissioned tiny leather boots to protect their falcons' feet during harsh winters, while others hired musicians to play near the mews, believing music soothed the birds' tempers. But why such extravagance for what was essentially a hobby? The answer lies in falconry's dual nature as both sport and political theater. A well-trained falcon could bring down herons or ducks for the table, yes, but more importantly, it demonstrated the owner's wealth, patience, and mastery over nature's most untamable creatures. When a lord rode out with his falconers, the spectacle wasn't just about hunting. It was a mobile display of prestige. Chronicles describe King Henry VIII hosting falconry parties where guests competed to see whose bird could climb highest before the stoop, that breathtaking dive where a falcon becomes a feathered missile, striking its prey at speeds over 200 miles per hour. The birds themselves became diplomatic currency. Gifting a rare Icelandic gyrfalcon could secure alliances more effectively than gold. The darker side of this noble obsession surfaced in the laws protecting these prized birds. The punishment for stealing a falcon could include having one's hands amputated, a grisly deterrent underscoring their value. At Dover Castle, records tell of a servant hanged for strangling his lord's favorite peregrine after it attacked him during training. Even accidental harm brought severe consequences. A knight squire once paid a year's wages in compensation for stepping on a prized merlin's tail feathers. This legal ferocity wasn't just about property, it was about maintaining the visible symbols of power in a society where perception often trumped reality. What's most poignant is how falconry transcended its practical roots to become something almost spiritual. Medieval manuscripts depict saints with falcons perched on their wrists, suggesting the birds symbolized the soul's ascent to God. The famous Hawking at the Brook tapestry shows noblewomen flying falcons with the same skill as men, their flowing sleeves and the birds' outstretched wings mirroring each other in delicate harmony. And when a beloved falcon died, some nobles buried them with tiny scrolls bearing prayers, their graves marked with carved stones, a tenderness rarely shown to human servants. The legacy of castle falconry lingers in unexpected places. That modern expression, "under your thumb," originates from the proper way to hold a falcon's jesses between thumb and forefinger. The sport's specialized vocabulary, bait for when a bird flaps wildly, ayers for a nestling still peppers falconry manuals today. And the next time you see a medieval portrait showing a noble with a bird on his glove, look closer. That frozen moment captures more than a hobby. It's the crystallization of an entire worldview, where dominance and grace, cruelty and devotion coexisted as seamlessly as a falcon's feathers slide through the wind. Beyond the castle's stern stone walls lay an unexpected oasis, the garden, where function and beauty intertwined like vines climbing a trellis. Far from being mere decoration, these carefully tended plots served as the castle's outdoor pantry, pharmacy, and perfumery all in one. Imagine the surprise of first-time visitors stepping from the gloomy corridors into this riot of color. Saffron crocuses painting the earth gold, rosemary bushes releasing their piney fragrance underfoot, and trellises heavy with climbing beans that would later thicken winter stews. The castle garden was a masterclass in medieval multitasking, where every plant earned its place through utility as much as aesthetics. Herbs formed the garden's backbone, their uses as varied as their aromas. Sage wasn't just for seasoning mutton, its leaves were steeped in vinegar to cleanse wounds. Lavender found its way into both linen chests, deterring moths, and sick rooms, calming feverish patients. Even the humblest plants had starring roles. Nettles were harvested for fiber to weave rough cloth, while marigold petals brightened butter and cheeses with their golden hue. At Kenilworth Castle, archaeologists uncovered garden beds arranged in precise geometric patterns, with medicinal plants like feverfew and valerian growing nearest the kitchen for easy access during emergencies. The gardens also served as living classrooms. Under the watchful eye of the lady of the castle or a knowledgeable nun, children learned to distinguish poisonous hemlock from beneficial parsley by the shape of their leaves. Herbalists, often women whose knowledge passed through generations, experimented with strange new plants brought by crusaders from the East. The famous Physic Garden at the Tower of London became a testing ground for exotic specimens like opium poppies and mandrake, their roots whispered to shriek when pulled from the earth. What's easily overlooked is how these gardens defied medieval stereotypes of drabness. Castle records list payments for flower seeds in vivid blues, reds, and yellows colors meant to dazzle as much as the family's tapestries or jeweled cups. Roses climbed walls not just for their scent, but because their petals could be distilled into costly rosewater for cooking and bathing. At Leeds Castle, the Countess's personal garden included a raised, flowery mead, where chamomile and thyme were planted between stepping stones to release fragrance when trodden upon, creating an early form of aromatherapy underfoot. The gardens also offered something castles sorely lacked: privacy. Tucked behind wattle fences or latticed arbors, they became sanctuaries where nobles could converse away from prying ears. Some featured turf benches where lovers exchanged tokens, their meetings shielded by towering stands of hollyhocks. The Bishop of Winchester's garden even had a pleasure garden with a central fountain, its splashing sounds helping mask confidential conversations from potential eavesdroppers. Perhaps the garden's greatest magic lay in their seasonal transformations. In spring, they burst with tender greens for Lenten meals. Summer brought bees buzzing between hives and flowers, their honey harvested to sweeten dishes and preserve fruits. Autumn saw the last medicinal roots dug up before frost, while winter's bare earth was strewn with straw to protect dormant plants. Through it all, the gardens whispered a quiet truth. Even in the martial world of castles, life found ways to be both practical and beautiful, one carefully tended plant at a time. That dank, claustrophobic chamber modern tourists call a dungeon was likely just the castle's storage cellar or cistern when medieval inhabitants walked its halls. The truth about castle justice would disappoint most Hollywood directors. Dark pits filled with moaning prisoners were far rarer than ledger books filled with fines and carefully recorded banishments. Medieval justice prized speed over suffering. Why waste resources feeding a thief for months when his hand could be branded or his ears nailed to the stocks in an afternoon? Records from castle courts reveal a system more bureaucratic than brutal. At Norwich Castle, the sheriff's account books list hundreds of cases resolved through structured penalties: a bushel of wheat for stealing chickens, 3 days in the pillory for slandering a neighbor. Temporary holding cells did exist, but they functioned more like modern drunk tanks than long-term prisons. A brawling knight might cool his heels overnight in a guardroom cellar until tempers eased, while a captured enemy soldier could be held in reasonable comfort until ransom negotiations concluded. The infamous oubliette, that bottomless pit where prisoners were supposedly forgotten, appears in exactly 0 contemporary medieval documents. What castles did have were detention spaces reflecting their era's pragmatic approach to crime. The Gatehouse Tower at Conwy Castle includes a modest chamber where offenders awaited trial, its single narrow window offering both light and a clear view of the gallows outside, a not-so-subtle incentive for confession. At Dover, the so-called dungeon was actually a storage room for siege supplies later repurposed by Victorian guides for dramatic effect. Even the Tower of London, synonymous with imprisonment, mostly housed high-status captives in apartments where they could receive visitors, play chess, and occasionally sneak out to nearby taverns under guard. The real shock isn't the absence of dungeons, but what replaced them. Public humiliation was the medieval justice system's weapon of choice. A cheese thief might be paraded through town wearing the spoiled goods around his neck, while a perjurer could find himself standing in the marketplace with his tongue pinned to a board. These spectacles served dual purposes, punishing the offender while reinforcing social norms to onlookers. For nobles, punishment was equally public but less physically harsh. Exile stripped them of power more effectively than any dark cell. Archaeology confirms this reality. Soil analyses of castle basements show no buildup of human waste, suggesting long-term occupation, while preserved door hinges lack the scratches left by decades of prisoner traffic. The few genuine dungeon-like spaces discovered, such as the bottle-shaped cell at Warwick Castle, were reserved for brief pre-trial containment, their intimidating design meant to soften up detainees for quicker confessions. Perhaps the greatest irony is how the dungeon myth took hold. 19th-century Gothic novelists and later filmmakers conflated medieval justice with the truly horrific prisons of early modern times. The Bastille's horrors in the 1700s or the rat-infested jails of Tudor England were grafted backward onto castles that had been ruins for centuries. Today's candlelit dungeon tours say more about Victorian fantasies than medieval realities. The next time you descend into a castle's shadowy undercroft, remember, you're likely standing in what was once the equivalent of a busy medieval office. Those vaulted ceilings echoed with the clink of wine barrels being rolled in, not the rattle of chains. Justice here was swift, public, and rarely wasted time on prolonged suffering. In a world where starvation loomed every winter, keeping someone alive in darkness wasn't punishment, it was an unaffordable luxury. Flames could transform a castle from an impenetrable fortress to a smoldering ruin faster than any invading army. Beneath the grandeur of tapestries and the warmth of hearths lurked a danger far more relentless than siege engines' fire, the silent enemy that respected neither rank nor stone walls. With wooden floorboards, thatched roofs in lesser chambers, and straw-strewn floors, castles were essentially giant tinderboxes waiting for a single spark. A carelessly placed candle, an overturned brazier, or even the glowing embers of the kitchen's bread oven could ignite disaster. The precautions against this ever-present threat reveal medieval ingenuity at its most pragmatic. Watchmen didn't just guard against human intruders, they were trained to sniff the air for the faintest whiff of smoke, their ears attuned to the ominous crackle of burning timber. At Windsor Castle, records show guards stationed on high towers with buckets of water and long hooked poles, ready to rip down burning roof thatch before flames could leap to neighboring buildings. The wealthiest castles invested in lead-lined water cisterns on upper floors, essentially medieval sprinkler systems, while others kept carts of wet sand ready to smother outbreaks. Some of the most fascinating firefighting tools were deceptively simple. Long wooden poles with iron hooks, called fire rakes, allowed teams to pull burning materials apart from a safe distance. Leather buckets lined with pitch hung at regular intervals along corridors, their locations drilled into every servant's memory. At Dover Castle, archaeologists found charred remains of what appears to be an early fire blanket, layers of wool soaked in vinegar and stored in metal chests near the kitchen, ready to be thrown over small blazes. The social dynamics during fires were equally revealing. When the alarm sounded, everyone from scullions to nobles sprang into action, forming bucket brigades that snaked from the nearest well to the danger zone. The castle's hierarchy temporarily flattened. A duke might find himself passing buckets alongside a stable boy if the flames threatened the grain stores. Some lords kept professional fire squads on retainer, quick-thinking laborers paid extra to risk their lives directing water onto roof fires from precarious perches. Yet for all their preparation, some fires still made history. In 1184, a disastrous blaze at Gloucester Castle started during a festive banquet when a stray spark ignited the great hall's timber ceiling. Within hours, the seat of royal power was reduced to ashes, along with priceless documents and treasures. The catastrophe prompted King Henry Roman II to order stone vaulting for castle halls across his realm, one of history's earliest building code reforms. What's often overlooked is how fire shaped castle design long before disaster struck. Those massive stone chimneys weren't just architectural statements. They were carefully engineered to contain sparks. Flammable storerooms were deliberately placed downwind of kitchens, while courtyards served as fire breaks between sections. At Conwy Castle, the placement of the bakery, isolated on a stone platform, shows how seriously builders took the threat. The legacy of this constant vigilance lingers in unexpected ways. Modern fire safety terms like curfew originate from castle life, derived from the French couvre-feu, the practice of covering hearths with metal lids at night. Those iron candle holders with drip pans we see in museums weren't just decorative, they were essential fire prevention tools. Even the tradition of whitewashing castle walls served a dual purpose, brightening interiors while creating a slightly fire-resistant lime coating. So the next time you admire a castle's towering beauty, remember, every stone placement, every bucket hook, every night watchman's call was part of an endless silent war against an enemy that needed no battering ram to breach the walls. The real marvel isn't that some castles burned, but that so many still stand testaments to generations of unseen vigilance against the flickering threat that could undo centuries of labor in one careless night. The castle's larder might overflow during peacetime, but when siege engines rolled into view, every loaf of bread and wheel of cheese suddenly became a weapon more vital than any sword. Starvation was the slowest and most merciless of medieval siege tactics, a war of attrition where the true battle wasn't fought on the ramparts, but in the growling stomachs of those trapped inside. As the portcullis slammed shut, the careful calculus of survival began. How many mouths to feed, how long the stores would last, and who would eat when rations grew desperate. Salt was the unsung hero of siege warfare. Barrels of herring and beef preserved in brine could last for months, though eating them day after day brought its own torment. Chroniclers describe defenders' lips cracking from the relentless salt, their thirst becoming unbearable as the castle's well ran low. Dried peas and lentils formed the backbone of siege meals, boiled into thin gruel that provided scant nutrition. The wealthiest might have stores of honey, nature's perfect preservative, to spread sparingly on hardtack biscuits, while the common soldiers gnawed on leathery strips of smoked mutton until their jaws ached. Livestock became walking larders. Chickens were kept alive as long as possible for their eggs, while cows were milked until they went dry, then slaughtered with grim efficiency. At Rochester Castle during its famous siege, defenders reportedly ate every horse, dog, and even the castle's pet cats before turning to the unthinkable, boiling parchment deeds and leather shields for whatever meager nutrients they might yield. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. One account describes a noblewoman trading her silver mirror for half a loaf of moldy bread after 3 months under siege. What's rarely discussed is the ingenuity of desperation. Castle gardens were quickly stripped of anything edible, not just vegetables, but rose hips, acorns, and even ornamental ivy leaves boiled into bitter tea. Beer turned sour was drunk anyway for its calories, while candle wax became a last resort hunger suppressant. At Chétau Gaillard, archaeologists found evidence of siege defenders catching and eating sparrows that nested in the walls, their tiny bones cracked open for marrow. The cruelest irony, many sieges ended not because walls were breached, but because malnutrition made defenders too weak to hold their weapons. Scurvy's telltale bruises appeared first, followed by the swollen bellies of famine. Dysentery spread through ranks weakened by hunger, while the wealthy, who had hoarded private stores, often held out longer, creating bitter class divisions. Records from the siege of Kenilworth describe guards falling asleep at their posts from exhaustion, their bodies consuming themselves for energy. Yet even in these dire straits, social hierarchies persisted. The lord and his family might dine on carefully rationed salt pork, while soldiers made do with greasy broth made from boiled horse bones. Some castles developed brutal rationing systems. At Dover, each person's daily allotment was marked by notches on a wooden tally stick, with severe punishments for theft. The final days before surrender often saw the most horrific choices. There are scattered accounts of cannibalism during particularly prolonged sieges, though historians debate their accuracy. The legacy of siege nutrition lingers in our language. That modern expression, tightening your belt, originates from the literal act of cinching one's tunic against hunger pangs during long blockades. More hauntingly, the children's rhyme, Peas Porridge Hot, references the endless monotony of siege meals, its verses about 9-day-old food painting a deceptively cheerful picture of dire scarcity. Next time you see a medieval castle storerooms, imagine them not as quaint pantries, but as the last line of defense against an enemy no sword could defeat, the relentless, gnawing void of an empty stomach. The image of a knight clanking through castle halls in 100 pounds of polished steel is pure Hollywood fantasy. In reality, that suit of armor would have been as impractical for daily wear as a modern soldier carrying a missile launcher to breakfast. Full plate armor was the medieval equivalent of a specialized combat uniform, reserved for battlefields and tournaments, not for lounging by the fire or attending council meetings. What knights actually wore around the castle might surprise you. Think less shining fortress and more stylish noble with a layered defense system. A knight's everyday outfit balanced protection with practicality. Over a linen undershirt, he'd wear a quilted gambeson, a thick padded jacket that could stop glancing blows and absorb sweat while breaking in new armor. These weren't just crude vests. Surviving examples show intricate stitching patterns that distributed weight evenly, with some lined with silk for nobility. The gambeson's versatility made it medieval outerwear. It could be worn alone for light protection or layered under chainmail when threats loomed. Accounts from the period describe knights playing chess in their gambesons or even riding out to hunt in them, their armor left safely in the care of squires. When more protection was needed but full plate was excessive, knights opted for half armor, a mix of chainmail and plate pieces that covered vital areas without sacrificing mobility. A typical ensemble might include a chainmail hauberk over the gambeson, paired with steel greaves for the legs and vambraces for the forearms. This compromise allowed for relative comfort while maintaining readiness. A knight could mount stairs without assistance or lift a goblet without needing both hands. The famous effigy of William Longisbay in Salisbury Cathedral shows this hybrid approach, his legs and arms armored while his torso appears more lightly clad for movement. The maintenance alone made constant armor wear impossible. Without daily cleaning, sweat and humidity would turn steel into a rust magnet, one reason squires spent hours polishing with sand and vinegar. Leather straps needed regular oiling to prevent cracking, while chainmail required meticulous rinsing to remove sweat salts that weakened the links. Some castles employed full-time armorers whose workshops smelled of linseed oil and beeswax, their days filled with repairing dents and replacing frayed arming points. The idea of sleeping in armor, as sometimes shown in films, would have been laughable. Knights valued their expensive gear too much to risk damaging it overnight. Tournaments provided the only regular showcase for full plate outside war. These events were the medieval equivalent of fashion runways mixed with extreme sports, where knights debuted gleaming custom armor with fluted designs or gold inlay. Even then, practicality won out. Jousting armor had thicker left sides to deflect lances, while foot combat suits prioritized flexibility. A surviving suit made for Henry VIII weighs 94 pounds, yet its articulated joints allowed astonishing range of motion when worn by a trained fighter. The real revelation comes from castle inventories and household accounts. Lists from Warwick Castle include payments for soft shoes for my lord's wear about the house and fine woolen hose to preserve his armor from sweat. One nobleman's diary complains about the inconvenience of receiving urgent news while armored, forcing him to dictate letters in just his gambeson. These mundane details paint a far more relatable picture than the stereotypical armored titan. Men who valued comfort as much as combat readiness, and who knew the true mark of nobility wasn't constant preparedness, but the privilege to choose when to suit up. So the next time you imagine a medieval castle's daily life, replace that clanking automaton with a figure in a richly dyed tunic, his sword belt slung casually over a padded jacket. The knight's real armor wasn't just steel, it was adaptability, knowing when to bear the weight of full plate and when to move unencumbered through the delicate dance of courtly life. That polished suit waiting in the armory, it was less a second skin than a rarely worn tool, as situational as a modern firefighter's gear, impressive when needed, but far too specialized for everyday use. That nightly tolling bell echoing through the castle walls carried more than just a warning. It marked the moment when fire, humanity's oldest ally, became its deadliest enemy. The curfew wasn't merely a suggestion. It was a life or death ritual. As the last notes of the couvre-feu bell faded, servants scurried to smother hearth flames under metal domes, while guards made rounds to ensure no candle or oil lamp burned unattended. In an instant, the castle transformed from a flickering beacon of warmth to a cavern of shadows, where the only light came from faintly glowing embers buried under layers of ash. This nightly extinction of flames had roots in grim necessity. Medieval records from castles like York and Dover list catastrophic fires started by nothing more than a carelessly placed rushlight or an overturned brazier. The infamous 1184 blaze at Gloucester Castle, which began during a banquet and reduced the royal residence to rubble, became a cautionary tale shouted from every watchtower. What began as pragmatic fire prevention soon evolved into something darker, a means of control. That same bell that saved lives also became a tool for enforcing order, its chime a reminder that even the highest-born lord wasn't above the rules of survival. The logistics of medieval fire safety were astonishingly sophisticated. Castles employed fire wards, teams of servants trained to inspect every hearth and torch sconce after curfew. At Warwick Castle, archaeologists uncovered small iron stamps bearing the Earl's crest, used to mark inspected fireplaces like a medieval safety certificate. Wealthy households used fire pans, lidded copper containers that allowed embers to be preserved overnight without risk, while poorer residents made do with burying coals in sand-filled pits. The penalty for ignoring curfew could be severe. Account books from 13th century London mention fines equivalent to a week's wages for keeping an unapproved flame burning after the bell. Yet the psychological impact of this daily plunge into darkness can't be overstated. Without modern lighting, the castle became a labyrinth of unseen hazards after curfew. Servants navigating corridors kept one hand on the walls to avoid collisions, while night watchmen developed an almost supernatural ability to identify people by their coughs or footsteps. The wealthy used bioluminescent tricks, placing glowworms in jars as primitive nightlights or soaking wooden chips in phosphorescent fungus, while others simply embraced the dark. Some chronicles describe nobles playing chess by touch alone, their fingers memorizing the grooves of carved pieces. What began as fire prevention bled into social control. Rebellious servants might whisper about the curfew being less about safety and more about limiting secret meetings or illicit romances. In times of unrest, lords could impose early or extended curfews to keep potential plotters isolated. The darkest twist, some castles rang false curfew bells to test loyalty. Those who emerged too quickly were suspected of planning nighttime mischief. The legacy of this fiery discipline lingers in our language and habits. Modern smoke detectors inherit the curfew bell's vigilant spirit, while the concept of closing time echoes that ancient command to extinguish and withdraw. Next time you flip a light switch without thought, remember the centuries when darkness wasn't a choice but a collective act of survival, when every evening ended with the solemn ritual of dousing flames, and every castle held its breath until dawn. Those whispered tales of phantom footsteps and spectral figures haunting castle corridors weren't just campfire stories. They were medieval damage control, woven from equal parts tragedy and political necessity. When a noblewoman's portrait seemed to weep blood or a long-dead knight's armor clanked through the night, these apparitions often served a chillingly practical purpose: to explain away inconvenient deaths or deter intruders from prying into dangerous secrets. The ghost stories clinging to castles like Dover or Chillingham weren't mere superstition. They were history's shadow language, where every moan in the dark hinted at buried scandals or unresolved vengeance. Take the famous White Lady of Warwick Castle, said to pace the towers in eternal grief. Historical records reveal she was likely Anne Beauchamp, a 15th century countess whose lands were seized after her family's downfall. The haunting conveniently discouraged questions about the suspiciously rapid redistribution of her estates to royal favorites. Similarly, the Green Boy of Alnwick Castle, a child spirit reportedly seen near a hidden passage, aligns with archaeological discoveries of a young skeleton walled up in the 12th century, possibly a noble heir eliminated to clear a succession path. These weren't just spooky legends, they were folk memory preserving truths too dangerous to speak aloud. The architecture itself fed the ghostly lore. Those sudden cold drafts in windowless rooms, they came from cleverly concealed air vents designed to prevent dampness unexplainable to medieval minds. Echoes bouncing off curved staircases became phantom footsteps, while flickering torchlight cast moving shadows that seemed to animate tapestries. Even the castle's defensive tricks backfired spectrally. Murder holes, openings where defenders dropped objects on attackers, later spawned tales of invisible hands shoving people downstairs. The line between ingenious design and supernatural terror was perilously thin. What's most fascinating is how nobles weaponized these stories. Some lords actively cultivated haunted reputations to keep peasants from scavenging ruins or servants from snooping in restricted areas. A chronicle from York mentions a knight who dressed as a ghost to patrol his treasury at night, scaring off would-be thieves. Other specters served as morality tales. The ghost of a dishonest steward forced to eternally count coins reminded castle staff to keep honest ledgers. Yet not all spirits were warnings, some offered bizarre comfort. The drunken monk of Pontefract Castle, said to haunt the cellars, became a beloved fixture whose appearances supposedly signaled an abundant harvest. At Windsor, sightings of Edward IV's ghost were considered good omens before battles. These benign haunts reveal a nuanced relationship with the supernatural, where the dead weren't just feared but consulted, their presence woven into the rhythm of daily life. Modern ghost hunters armed with EMF meters are latecomers to a tradition medieval people perfected. They read castle walls like eerie archives, every bloodstain on the flagstones, every hastily whitewashed mural hinting at concealed violence. Those spine-tingling legends weren't entertainment. They were the subconscious of stone and mortar, whispering secrets even the chronicles dared not record. So the next time you hear a castle ghost story, listen closer. Behind the rattling chains and mournful wails lies something far more haunting, the uncanny persistence of truth refusing to be buried. The grand stone walls that once defied armies often met their most humiliating defeat not from catapults or trebuchets, but from something far more mundane: indifference. The romantic ruins we admire today, draped in ivy and whispering of lost glory, are frequently monuments to practicality rather than conquest. As warfare shifted from castle sieges to open field battles with gunpowder weapons, these towering fortresses became expensive relics overnight. Lords who once bragged about their impenetrable keeps now grumbled about leaky roofs and drafty halls, their eyes turning toward the comforts of newly fashionable manor houses with glass windows and proper chimneys. Consider the fate of mighty Kenilworth Castle, which survived a legendary 6-month siege only to be casually abandoned when its owner found the rooms too cramped for modern tastes. Without constant maintenance, a castle's decline was shockingly rapid. Lead roofing stripped for profit left timbers exposed to rot, while stolen stones became farm walls or village cottages. At Raglan Castle, locals joked that the magnificent fortress was being undressed stone by stone, its carefully carved blocks ending up in pigsties and tavern hearths. Nature moved swiftly to reclaim what humans had abandoned. Ivy roots pried apart mortar joints, birds nested in arrow loops, and rainwater pooled in collapsed cellars, creating accidental moats where frogs croaked where knights once stood vigil. The economics of castle upkeep became impossible to justify. A single crumbling tower might require 100 laborers and a forest's worth of scaffolding, while the same funds could build an elegant brick mansion with all the latest comforts. Records from the Earl of Northumberland's estates show him weighing the cost of repairing crumbling battlements against installing Italian marble fireplaces in his new London townhouse, a calculation that left the castle to its fate. Even royalty weren't immune. Henry VIII allowed entire wings of his palaces to decay while lavishing attention on his modern hunting lodges. Yet abandonment wasn't always passive. Some lords actively decommissioned their castles to prevent rivals from using them, methodically smashing staircases and breaching walls. At Corfe Castle, parliamentary forces deliberately collapsed towers after the English Civil War, creating picturesque ruins that tourist pamphlets would later falsely attribute to Viking raids. Other castles suffered death by paperwork. Legal disputes over inheritance could leave them in limbo for decades, their caretakers unpaid and their roofs slowly caving in. The most poignant relics are those caught mid-decline. At Tattershall Castle, archaeologists found a single furnished room still in use amid the ruins, its 16th century occupant stubbornly clinging to ancestral pride while the rest of the structure molded. Elsewhere, great halls became barns, chapels turned into cattle sheds, and dungeons served as root cellars, practical repurposing that couldn't halt the inevitable. What's often overlooked is how these ruins shaped history in their afterlife. Romantic poets and painters transformed crumbling castles into symbols of melancholy beauty, while Victorian tourists scrambled over them seeking Gothic thrills. That ivy-covered archway wasn't just nature reclaiming stone, it was the beginning of a new story, where abandonment gave these structures a second life as monuments to human impermanence. The true secret isn't why castles fell, but how their quiet surrender to time became their most enduring legacy. From the clamor of the kitchens to the hushed politics of the solar, medieval castles were living, breathing organisms pulsing with human drama behind every arrow slit and under every vaulted ceiling. These 30 revelations aren't just historical trivia, they're keys to unlocking an entire worldview. Consider how the humble garderobe doubled as a pest control system, or how a lady's keys jingling at her belt signaled more authority than most crowns. Even the castle's ghost served a purpose, their whispered legends papering over scandals too dangerous to speak aloud. What makes these discoveries so vital is how they shatter our flat, Hollywood version of the Middle Ages. This wasn't some monotonous era of grime and gloom. It was a time of startling sophistication, where nobles bathed in rosewater while engineers calculated the exact curvature of a murder staircase. The castle stones held contradictions, cruelty and compassion, filth and fastidiousness, blistering summer feasts and winters spent huddled around smoking braziers. Every architectural quirk, from the placement of the Buttery to the width of a spiral stair, was a calculated response to human needs, both noble and brutally practical. These secrets also remind us that history isn't made by faceless masses, but by individuals navigating their world with ingenuity. That cook who turned spoiled meat into a spiced delicacy, the jester walking the knife's edge between humor and treason, the child squire memorizing heraldry, symbols between sword drills. Their choices shaped these spaces as much as any king's decree. Castles weren't frozen in time, they evolved with each generation's triumphs and failures, their walls absorbing everything from whispered rebellions to the scent of freshly baked maslin bread. So the next time you stand before a castle's weathered stones, look closer. That groove in the step wasn't worn by tourists, it's the mark of centuries of servants hauling firewood. The faint discoloration on the wall, perhaps the shadow of a tapestry that once dazzled ambassadors with its gold thread. These buildings weren't designed to be museums, but stages for lives both extraordinary and ordinary. Whether you're fascinated by the politics of falconry or the engineering behind garderobe chutes, every detail whispers the same truth. The past was never simple, and its people were far more like us than we've been led to believe. If this journey through hidden courtyards and candlelit chambers has sparked your curiosity, there's always more to discover. Drop your favorite revelation in the comments. Did the siege pantry surprise you, or was it the strategic power of chess? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's overlooked corners. After all, every castle has its secrets, and we've only just begun to lift the portcullis on the past.